Josie Walter Durante at the New York Times.
Listen, I really need to talk to you. I found something big. You can break this story wide open.
What do you want?
The story no one is talking about.
Ukraine.
I'm really pleased today to be able to moderate this discussion with Andrea Chalupa, who is the scriptwriter for the movie Mr. Jones. Andrea is a New York-based writer. She's also the host of a podcast called Gaslit Nation. This, I believe, is her first film, but I know she worked on it for many years, and we'll get into some of what inspired her and why she did it.
Yes, hello, Andrew. My name's Philip Colley. I'm the great nephew of Gareth Jones. I know the story of Gareth Jones, I think, better than anybody on this earth, and also the backstory of Mr. Jones. And it wasn't so happy, Andrea. There were some sad things. And I'll let me. My mother and brother. My mother died. My brother kind of died unhappy because of the way he was treated to do with the film. He was lied to. But the biggest lie, the biggest lie, let me finish, the biggest lie was the telling of the film itself. It turned the true story of Gareth Jones on its head. The toxic narrative that it was a genocide committed by Russians against Ukrainians. There's a genocide being committed right now using starvation as a weapon in Gaza. And we're all silent, and our government is complicit. And we're talking about a possible genocide of 90 years ago today, and we're saying nothing about a very real genocide taking place. This is the real Andrea. See the real Andrea. Yeah. So, well, I know you have to respect the truth of Gareth Jones' story, and Mr. Jones has turned the story on its head. It's a fictional nonsense, Andrea, and you know that. Shame on you.
Yeah, Andrea came into my family's life, I think, around 2006, and she was interested in, found out about my great uncle and got in touch with my mother, Dr. Margaret Colley, who wrote Gareth's biography and who was Gareth's niece. And I think my mother thought that she was going to make a film about my great uncle and tell his story. But to cut a long story short, what Andrea did was take the basic kind of bones of the story and then make a propaganda film as part of the Holodomor industry that I know you've written about recently, and turn Gareth from the person who the journalist who exposed the Great Soviet Famine into the journalist who exposed the Holodomor, which is just a kind of the Ukrainian nationalist version of what happened back then in the 30s. Anyway, I found out that Andrea was coming to London. And so I decided to go and pay her a visit because she's made a lot of political capital, a lot of propaganda capital out of this film. And she kind of lied. She lied to my mother. At the time she said that she would always talk about her. And whenever she wrote about the film or mentioned the film, she would mention my mother because she was the main source. And although she did on that evening actually mention her, generally she's completely airbrushed her out of the story. And she also used my brother Nigel, who gave her a great deal of assistance in taking her around Wales, introducing it to the story, and gave her lots of ideas for the film.
Taking place. This is the real Andrea.
But gradually, when he realised that she wasn't going to tell the story of Gareth Jones, she was going to tell the story of Indiana Jones, a version. He became disillusioned, and she kind of dropped him, and he was very upset about it. And sadly, he passed away. Upset about it. So I thought I'd take the opportunity to go and state the family's case that she'd lied about this film. And the trouble is with this film, of course, is everybody knows about Gareth Jones from it, and what they know is a myth, not the real person, a myth that's been created by Ukrainian nationalists.
Was this your first time meeting her in person?
No, I'd been up to the after my brother died. I kind of had to take on the mantle of Gareth Jones, because before then it was him and my mother who'd been sort of dealing with the story and who'd brought him back from obscurity, really. But then my mother died in 2011 and he died, I think, 2018. And so, all of a sudden there was this film being made, and I got in touch with her. They invited me up to the set. They wanted I think they needed kind of family approval of it. And I flew up to Edinburgh and met the actors, met James Norton, saw how a film was being made, saw the huge amounts of money that were being spent on this. So there were a fleet of articulated lorries that had been to Ukraine and then come back to Britain, then up to Scotland. And so it was very interesting in a way. But we clashed because I went up to say, this isn't the true story, and I think we were particularly upset about the scene of him eating human flesh, which of course is complete nonsense, as was much of the film, as I gradually found out. So I clashed with her there, and also at the screening of the film. She gave us a private viewing, and when we saw what she'd produced, I had a run-in with her then as well.
Okay, Raphael Lemkin, who coined the term genocide, used the Soviet famine in Ukraine as the classic example.
Raphael Lemkin was talking at a time when no academic works,
insinuating that Gareth was a Nazi.
No academic works have been written by the time when Lemkin was. I don't want attention for myself. I want to stand up for the truth. For the truth.
She was referring to an article I wrote for Le Monde. I think it was last year, and absolutely, I did not accuse him of being a Nazi, and I say that in the article. What I accused her and other Ukrainian nationalists is ignoring the fact that he did have dealings with the Nazis, and why were they ignoring all this? Particularly, for example, in Andrea's film Mr. Jones. At the end of the film, we see Mr. Jones languishing in a Soviet kind of jail after his trip to Ukraine, whereas in reality he was being wined and dined at the not wined because he was a teetotaler. He was being dined at the German consulate in Kharkiv, and they went to the opera, and he was in great comfort, But of course, that's not mentioned because they don't want to bring the Nazis into the story, because of course they have their own issues. He was born in Barry to a very progressive middle-class family. His father was headmaster of the local grammar school there in Barry. His mother, his name was Major Edgar Jones. His mother, my great-grandmother, Annie Gwen Jones, is a very important part of the story. She went to Russia in 1887, I believe, to the Ukraine, as it was then, to be a tutor to the children of a Welsh industrialist, or the son of a Welsh industrialist, who set up the steelworks there in a place called Huzovska, which is today's Donetsk. And she spent 3 years there. She learnt Russian, and that's quite probably where Gareth got his first sense of adventure and the idea that it was normal to travel abroad, and probably got taught a little bit of Russian on her knee as well. So she had a very interesting story on her own. And he was brought up in Barry in the shadow of the First World War. He was a brilliant academic, linguistically very talented. He spoke 5 languages. Welsh was the home language they spoke at home. He spoke English. And then he mastered German, French, and Russian. And he went to Cambridge University. He was one of the best students, I think, language students they'd had there. And he, to cut a long story short, after he left Cambridge, he landed a plum job as a private secretary for David Lloyd George, the our prime minister in the First World War, also a Welshman, he was only 26, I think. It's in at the beginning of the 1930s, and all of a sudden he was walking the corridors of power, around Westminster, meeting the great and the good. You know, he met Winston Churchill, he met all the leading politicians. He was sort of dining at the Reform Club, the great liberal gentlemen's club in London. And on the back of his employment with Lloyd George, he made his first trip to Russia in 1930, and that was really the beginning of his writing career, I suppose. He did have a trial with the Times just after he left university, but I think he was, but they said he needed more experience, which he certainly went and got later on.
What do you want?
The story no one is talking about.
Ukraine.
He was there for about 3 weeks in 1930, and went down on a kind of a pilgrimage to what was then no longer Hizovskoye, but now was, I think, Stalino. And he found, it was pretty rough down there, and he left early because all he could get to eat was a sort of bread roll, and it was, very. They were already the first tailwinds of famine, I guess. And then he went back in 1931. He was accompanying Jack Hines, who he was introduced to by Ivy Lee. After his first stint of employment with Lloyd George, he went to America and worked for Ivy Lee, the press magnate, who knew, was it Howard Hines? Anyway, the son of the guy that set up the baked beans, Heinz 57 Varieties outfit, and he asked him to accompany his son to the Soviet Union. Gareth jumped at the chance, and they went and spent 3 or 4 weeks traveling down to Rostov, I think, down the Volga, and over into I think to Kharkov the first time, and had a really interesting time, and saw collectivization and how it wasn't going so well. Gareth, from the age of about 17, he visited Germany every year for 10 years, and he witnessed Germany after suffering the injustices of the Versailles Treaty. There was great poverty and impoverishment of the middle classes because of the war debt, and how did he get the flight with Hitler? Well, he made contacts. He wrote letters. He wrote a letter to Ernst Hanfstaengl, who was Hitler's private secretary, a Harvard-educated German who understood American ways of electioneering, helped Hitler with his electioneering campaign, I believe. And originally he was offered a trip in 1932 with a journalist called Sefton Delmer, who worked for the Daily Express, but Gareth, for one reason or other, couldn't make that trip. Sefton Delmer could. So a year later, he was offered the chance again, and again with Sefton Delmer. They landed this flight with Hitler on his election campaign, and they were the first journalists after Hitler became chancellor to fly with him. And he wrote it was a lovely, it was a 16-seater plane, and he sat just 3 or 4 yards, 3 or 4 feet, let's say, behind Hitler, two rows behind him. And he wrote, if this plane should crash, the whole history of Germany would be changed. And often, it's a very interesting line. What a lot of people don't know is that the day before he'd flown from the Gdansk, what is today's Gdansk, in the Danzig corridor. He'd flown from there to Berlin, and his plane almost had crashed. They'd had to make an emergency landing in a town called Stolp, and so he had the idea of planes crashing, and it must have been a much more nerve-wracking experience flying in planes those days, even on the Richthofen, which was probably one of the best planes in Germany at the time. So that was what inspired that line. So Gareth, he had great sympathy for Germany and for the Germans because of the injustice of the Versailles Treaty, and he was a real Germanophile. But he was in no way a Nazi. He just was a journalist who, because of his language skills, was able to, and his charm and his skill at opening doors, was able to get access to the Führer.
How soon does he, after interviewing or on that plane with Hitler, does he end up going back to the Soviet Union?
That was on the 23rd of February. And he enters the Soviet Union, I think, on the 4th or the 5th of March. So, but what is interesting though, so he gets on the flight, and when he gets off the flight, he goes to the Festhalle in Frankfurt and watches, and he's on the stage with Hitler. Hitler makes this amazing speech. Gareth writes a fantastic article about the power of Hitler's oratory. He compares it to Lloyd George's oratory, but with subtle differences, and he compares the euphoria of the crowd to the Eisteddfod in Wales. It's a really interesting articles. And then that evening, Gareth, Hitler, and Goebbels head off to the train station. Hitler goes off to Munich. Gareth and Goebbels end up having a private dinner in the Hotel Baselhof, I think it was, and they had a really, I think it was a really interesting time. Goebbels writes about it in his diary, and he didn't write about people very much, but he wrote about Gareth and said, I spent a lovely evening with this very intelligent young man from Wales who tells me terrible things about the Soviet Union. And Gareth kind of, was quite taken with Goebbels, it seems. He thought he was a very charming man with a great sense of humor. And he said, famously said, I feel at home with Goebbels. And I think on an intellectual level, they were good sparring partners. And I think Goebbels would have been impressed by his German and the knowledge he'd accrued at that time. But so yeah. But I think he said that he was at home with Goebbels because when he met Hitler, he didn't feel at home with him at all. He felt Hitler was a very cold, calculating, emotionless person, and a very ordinary. He compared him to a middle-class grocer, and Goebbels as a South Wales miner. And he spoke about Hitler's very emotionless eyes. So I think compared to Hitler, he found Goebbels a bit easier to get on with.
So what is the connection between the Germans and his reporting in the Soviet Union about the famine? Because I feel like there is at least a perception that he was some kind of Nazi propagandist. I mean, you've already sort of addressed that.
Yeah, that's very unfortunate. I think, there's two sides. I was reading today that some Marxist sort of website, and they're saying because he flew with Hitler, he was a Nazi, and he wrote for the Berliner Tages. He was a journalist for the Berliner Tagesblatt, and they're on this side, they're trying to deny that a famine ever took place, which is nonsense. Of course, there was a famine, and thanks to Gareth, we know that there was a terrible famine across all of the Soviet Union, but particularly in Kazakhstan and Ukraine. And then on the other side, we have the Ukrainian nationalist version that is making this famine into a genocide by Russians. Which again, Gareth's testimony says the opposite. Of that. How does it get? How does he become tarnished with this? Well, I think it's very interesting. And something that hasn't been picked up in the people that have written about Gareth. They tended to ignore, his connections with Germany and how he got down there. It was always thought, oh, he just escaped from the train or sneaked down there, which wasn't true. Wasn't true at all.
That's what happens in Mr. Jones.
In Mr. Jones, yes, he sneaks down there. No, that's not true at all. He gets invited down by the vice consul of the German consulate in Kharkiv, a chap called Oscar Ert. Now, nobody knew this. This was discovered by a Russian expert called Teresa Cherfas, who made the documentary Hitler, Stalin and Mr. Jones. She speaks Russian. She went to the Russian archives and she found some information about all this that the Russians had made. And it was put that in her recounting of it, the chap's name was Erte, Eherte. And you go on Google and look for this, there's nobody there, you know, no one who was so. But I thought, must be some. So I took the E off Ert, Googled around, found this guy, Oscar Ert, Googled a little bit more and found out that his son was a guy called Adolf Ert, who some weeks or some months later would become head of the Anti-Comintern, which was the department of Goebbels' propaganda ministry, charged with dishing the dirt on Soviet Russia, Judeo-Bolshevism as they called it. And this was a very interesting discovery. Doesn't at all mean that Gareth was a Nazi, but Gareth was a journalist and he did used whatever means he could to get the end which he was seeking, which was to expose this famine, which he knew was happening, but he knew the world didn't know about. So the interests of Gareth and the interests of the Nazis coincided in a way. Gareth was a journalist who wanted to expose the famine for humanitarian reasons. The Nazis wanted to expose the famine for propaganda reasons. They wanted to put down Marxism. So they had a similar purpose. I mean, what I find is interesting, and another of my theories is that Hitler used the famine as part of his election campaign. He only mentions it once in a speech, a very important speech, before the election that brought the Nazis to power on March the 5th, 1933. On March the 2nd, he makes a speech, I think March the 2nd, March the 3rd, where he talks about millions of people dying in the breadbasket of Europe, and that this showed that the theory of Marxism, this was the refutation of the theory of Marxism. You know, Marxism brings you famine. Before that, I think, you know, for example, Reagan Mashin, who's written a book about it, this matter said that this showed that Hitler didn't need Gareth to bring him propaganda about the famine. But of course, that's not quite the case, because 7 days earlier, Gareth had been dining with Joseph Goebbels. Gareth tells Goebbels that the famine is going on. Goebbels really doesn't seem to know about this famine, and people didn't know about the famine. You know, that nothing was mentioned in the German press, and the German diplomats at the time were concealing it from the Nazi Party because they didn't want them to use it as propaganda. They didn't want to rock the boat with the Soviets. There was something at the time, the Rapallo policy, which was a sort of pact or an arrangement between the Soviets and the Germans, a mutual help arrangement after the First World War. And they wanted to keep that going. So it is quite possible that Hitler found out via Goebbels of the famine from Gareth. So they used it in that way. And really they used it to sort of slam Marxism, but also they were preparing the ground for the invasion of Soviet Ukraine. That was the goal in many ways of the Second World War, was to get the Lebensraum in Soviet Ukraine. Also, you know, some months later they used the famine. I've seen German newspaper articles where they're saying, you know, oh, look at the Western press, they're criticizing us for claiming we're persecuting the Jews, you know, but nobody's died. Look, Gareth Jones wrote these articles about millions of people dying in the Soviet Union, and they're all true, you know, but the Western press isn't paying any attention to them. They're just paying attention to us. So they did use his journalism to deflect from what was going on in Germany. But Gareth, that doesn't, you know, Gareth was just a journalist saying what he saw. You know, he was an honest and a very good journalist who exposed what people were trying to hide, and that's what a journalist is supposed to do. So there's no shame whatsoever, I believe, in what Gareth did. How people use his information, is not his responsibility.
You will retract your statements to the press immediately.
Or they will shoot our engineers.
The most important thing is that Gareth reported on famine across all the grain growing areas of the Soviet Union. He interviewed, people of multiple ethnicities, whereas in Mr. Jones, it's just Ukraine. He gets off the train in Ukraine, spends 3 weeks, whatever it is, trudging around in the snow, eating trees, eating people, in this, having a terrible time, which really wasn't the case. His actual trek, he gets off the train in Russia. Most of his actual walking, I believe, was on the Russian side of the border. He gets off the train just south of Belgorod. We all know Belgorod now. And he spends his first night in a sort of collective, I believe. And it's there that he meets his first people with extended bellies, children with swollen stomachs from starvation. They were Russians. And one of the famous quotes used is that the Ukrainian nationalists use is, we are waiting for death. This quote, again, I believe, comes from a Russian on the Russian side of the border. Gareth also interviews peasants. I mean, he interviews plenty of Ukrainian peasants in Moscow who've come all the way up there to buy bread, bringing all their valuables and exchanging them for bread. But he also interviews on the outskirts of Moscow starving Russian peasants who say they're killing us, and they're talking about the Bolsheviks, not about the Russians. That's who they mean. And Gareth also interviews German colonists who are starving. And he also reports on the situation in Kazakhstan, where 1 million out of 5 million, perhaps more, a greater proportion of the population died from starvation even than Ukraine. So he's reporting on the great Soviet famine. And he was a voice for all of those people who died of starvation. Yes, proportionately more people died in Kazakhstan and in Ukraine, but several million Russians also died. And for each individual person, their experience of starvation was exactly the same as an individual Kazakh or an individual Ukrainian. And it's a great injustice to him, I believe, that his story has been twisted so that he was just reporting on Ukraine, and he's a hero of Ukraine. He's a hero for all the victims of Stalin's excesses, all the victims of the great Soviet famine. And that's how he should be remembered. Well, collectivization, I think he was initially attracted by the Bolshevik policy of Korenizatsiya, the nationality policy that was worked on by Stalin, actually, which brought minority languages to the fore, encouraged minority languages, minority culture. Ukrainian language was a great boon for Ukrainian national consciousness. So he was very much attracted by that. But it was collectivization that he saw as the great evil. He had good things to say about industrialization. He said there was a mixed picture, but they'd done a lot of good work. He even commented. He said he was very impressed by the tractor factory in Kharkov. That he visited after his trek through the countryside. And he also thought that the Bolshevik education policy had good things to say about that. They increased literacy, and he had good things to say that. Particularly, he talked about Lenin's widow, Krupskaya, who he met and interviewed, and what a great effect she'd had on the education system. He saw good things and bad things in both communism and fascism. You see, the interest of, Gareth, when he went out to America, he saw capitalism failing. He saw people queuing up to buy at the soup kitchens, thousands of unemployed sleeping in doss houses. In Wales, he saw the unemployed hanging around. There was no jobs there. So he saw, and this was at the time of the Great Depression. So at the time, people were looking for answers, and at that time, in the early 30s, the Holocaust hadn't happened, and people were still open to the possibility that fascism was the solution or communism was the solution. So Gareth kept an open mind, and in Nazi Germany, he saw in those early days, he wrote favourably about the labour camps that were, helping the problem of unemployment, and was this a solution? And he also saw some good things about the Soviet Union, so the communism. But also he saw famine, and I think this coloured his attitude towards the rise of what was going on in Germany. He'd seen what had happened in the 20s, and perhaps he would have thought, well, this would be terrible if communism. And that was really the two options in Germany at the time, was the Communist Party or the Nazi Party. And Gareth would have much rather have neither of them, but in what he was witnessing in the Soviet Union, he wouldn't have wanted that for Germany. So it's understandable he kept an open mind, but he was very, very quick to condemn the Nazis for their brutality and for their anti-Semitism, their shrieking anti-Semitism, as he called it. So he had no time for the policy, for the most of the policies of the Nazis, but they were there. They he couldn't change the government. And I suppose he did see that at that time in the early 30s, after Hitler was elected, there was a period of intense national euphoria in Germany. People, as long as you weren't Jewish, then or communist, or gypsy or gay, then things probably looked pretty rosy, and they were convinced by the propaganda. And Gareth would have, couldn't have helped think, well, people seem pretty happy here, and most Germans were lovely people. It's very civilized, and he recommended people to come over to Germany. Generally, it's all right, he said, and of course, it was for them.
When did he denounce the Nazis? Because he died young, before the Holocaust and maybe even before Kristallnacht, right?
He died before Kristallnacht. He denounced them pretty soon on, and which makes it all the more galling that he's accused of being a Nazi. He wasn't. He was a liberal. He was a pacifist. He was an internationalist. He decried as I said, the anti-Semitism. He was also wrote about the Night of the Long Knives and the murder of Schleicher, and he definitely wrote honestly and openly about the rise, and he wasn't in glowing terms by any means.
Is there anything else you'd like to add about his reporting in the Soviet Union and inaccuracies in the film Mr. Jones?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's lots of things, but what gets me is the way that the famine has been weaponized by Ukrainian ultranationalists on two occasions. The first occasion was between 1941 and 1943, when propaganda about the famine was used to encourage other people to join in with the Holocaust by Holocaust of bullets. It's often said that nobody talked about the famine until the 80s or 90s, but that wasn't true. When after the Nazi invasion, it was talked about all the time, and they used it for propaganda purposes. And it was the Jews that took the rap and were murdered for it. But then, come 43, come Stalingrad, well, it all changed, and the Jews eventually were no longer to blame. Now it's the Russians that are to blame, and the famine has been weaponized again, and Gareth's reporting has been weaponized again. So that's a very concerning and a very unfortunate a fortunate thing that's happened. So.
Well, can you also talk about what was the process of Gareth Jones breaking that news? Because it happened in Germany and then he went to England, is it? Because I think in the movie they skipped that. Like I haven't seen the movie in a while, but I think it ends with him having like a press conference in England or something too.
Yeah, it's nonsense. He has a he comes out of Russia. I mean, he goes back up after his 3-day walk. He spends 2 nights, one night in the Soviet Union, one night in Russia, crosses the border, which wasn't sealed for him certainly. Spends 1 night in Ukraine, 3 nights perhaps at the Russian consulate, comes back up to, gets the train with the German consul, a chap called Walter, in quite great comfort, and dines that evening with the German ambassador, Dirksen, in Moscow. That would have been an interesting conversation. None of that is recorded. And then he spends another few days in Moscow where he interviews Maxim Litvinov, gets more information, I guess, from other journalists and diplomats, gets the train out of Moscow, I think via Danzig, and then he makes his big announcement in Berlin. There were just a couple of journalists there. So it wasn't a major press conference by any means, possibly organised by a journalist called Paul Schäfer, who'd been expelled from the Soviet Union a couple of years earlier for reporting on negatively about the Soviet Union. And so his first, 2 articles come out in the first time. I mean, he gives away, he's got this scoop. It's really interesting. Instead of keeping it all to himself, he just gives it away. He wants it out there as soon as possible. And these 2 articles come out in America on the 29th of March. And the headline, the main thing he says is, everywhere is the cry, there is no bread, we are dying. This cry came from all over Russia, from Central Asia, from Siberia, from Belarus, from the Volga, from the Caucasus, and also Ukraine. In one or two of those, it doesn't actually even mention Ukraine, to be honest, but he's clearly talking about famine across the whole Soviet Union. And then the articles come out, and then within, I don't know, 1 or 2 days, this Walter Duranty writes an article for the New York Times saying, no, there's no famine. There's people dying of malnutrition from diseases due to malnutrition, but there's no famine, nobody dying of famine. And he discredits Gareth and says, this guy just been there a few days, what does he know? Young whippersnapper doesn't know what he's talking about. And of course, Duranty at that time was a Pulitzer Prize winning famous journalist who people were going to believe him rather than Gareth. So Gareth was a real shock to Gareth, because I think, it was he knew that the journalists knew that there was a famine going on. And here they were, journalists, denying it. They were all living nice, comfortable lives, and they had pressure put on them by the Soviet press office that if they wanted to get access to stories, and particularly that there was the Metro Vickers trial going on at the time. The British engineers had been arrested, and that was what was really interesting. So the pressure put on by the Soviet press office, but also I think people like Duranty and maybe Louis Fisher, they were still held out hope for the communist experiment which was going on, and we forget this was the great opportunity for socialism. This was a once in a millennia chance to achieve socialist paradise on earth. I guess that's how the people at the top saw it, and they wanted to industrialize rapidly and collectivize. In order to do that, they needed to collectivize, and they were materialists of a few human lives to them perhaps didn't mean very much. And of course, in the end, it looks like collectivization did sort of work in the end. But those early days were hell, and the peasants didn't want to give up the land that they'd only just got after the 1917 revolution. They wanted to stay as private farmers. They didn't want to give it all up, and they resisted collectivization. Certainly in 1932, they all kind of went on strike and refused to go out and plant, sow the seed, and there was a kind of a civil, by all accounts, kind of a civil war going on between the peasants and the state, and ultimately the state won. So those journalists up in maybe they saw it in those kind of terms, that this in the long term, which is a very brutal. And other people make the argument that the Soviets did industrialize, and if they hadn't done it so quickly, then maybe they wouldn't have been able to resist the Nazi invasion in 1941. Hitler thought that they would be a pushover. He didn't think that they had the industrial means to resist his mighty army. But they'd obviously he was wrong on that.
So what happens to Gareth Jones after he comes back and he's basically ignored?
When he comes back from Germany, he writes lots of articles. Was he ignored? He wasn't completely ignored, but he obviously had upset the Soviets. In particular, he upset Maxim Litvinov, the foreign minister, who he'd interviewed under false pretenses. Maxim Litvinov thought he was, still kind of working for Lloyd George, which he wasn't really. And so he complained to Lloyd George, and Lloyd George sort of dropped Gareth from that point on. He'd been his darling boy, before then, but he'd gone too far this time. And of course, at that time, the British establishment had an eye on the Nazis. They were worried about them. They saw that Russia might possibly be an ally. They might need them as an ally soon. And also, it mustn't be forgotten that the British were buying grain from the Soviets. They were buying cheap grain to feed the unemployed here. So the British government knew that there was famine going on in the Soviet Union, particularly down in Ukraine. And nonetheless, they turned a blind eye to that and saw their own interests of getting cheap grain for the unemployed. And Gareth's reporting probably didn't, made them perhaps look bad. People did write letters saying, "What are we doing? If what this guy is saying is true, why are we buying this grain? Surely we should leave it for the Soviets, for the Russians to eat."
I am searching for the site of a murder which took place out here nearly 80 years ago. This is the only film of the man who died, a few seconds, taken at a meeting with Adolf Hitler. The murdered man was a brilliant Welsh journalist called Gareth Jones. He was trying to find out what the Japanese army was plotting in China.
He died in August, died the day before his 30th birthday, on August the 12th, 1935. He was a journalistic rocket, and that kind of came back down to earth after these reports, that were true, which were denied. So, but he had a job with the Western Mail, which is a newspaper in South Wales, and he'd done in the early 30s. Then the people of South Wales were some of the best informed people in the world about the political situation in Europe. Because of Gareth's reporting. After he came back, he did less of the international reporting. He went off and did a lot of reports on Welsh culture. He went walking around in the countryside, interviewing peasants, Welsh peasants, and as my brother Nigel said, he was cupcakes and coracles was his. So he spent a little while doing that, and then he kept going back to Germany. So he did a lot of reports from Germany through 1934, and he did some lecture. He didn't do any. He stopped writing about the famine in around April. Not many articles, but although he did go and do some talks around Wales. And then at the end of, he had the idea to go on a world tour, and I think to fill in the blanks in his knowledge, because by this time he had such, even though he was 28, 29, he had such a wealth of knowledge of international affairs. He'd been, among the great and the good of America. He'd been in the political circles there. He understood America. He understood Germany. He'd spent all this time in Russia. He'd spent all this time in the corridors of power in Westminster, and met so many people: Hitler, Goebbels, Lloyd George, Ivy Lee, de Valera in Ireland. He also went over to Ireland and interviewed, did some great reporting there of the struggle between the Irish and the British. It's another story. So the one part of the world he didn't know, but which he knew was important, was the Far East. And of course, things were happening there. The Japanese had invaded Manchuria and set up, it was in northeast China, set up a puppet state there with Puyi, the former Chinese emperor, and were threatening to either invade China or invade Siberia. So this was also relevant to the famine at the time. Stalin was very worried that the Japanese were going to invade, and so a lot of the food stocks, perhaps this is another argument, I'm playing devil's advocate here, a lot of the food stocks, the strategic food reserves, were being kept for the army in case the Japanese were going to invade and put the whole socialist project to an end. So Gareth goes off. But first of all, he goes off to America. He goes back to America. I think it's third time, and in late '34, and he dines. He's spent some time in New York, and then he goes off to the west to California, the West Coast. Yeah, and he goes to Los Angeles. He stays with Randolph Hearst in his ranch at San Simeon. As New Year's Day he spends with Randolph Hearst, and who in the meantime, if I can just regress a little bit, Gareth meets Randolph Hearst in Wales. He owned a castle there, St Donat's Castle. Gareth goes and interviews him there. In the film, this is sort of all completely changed in Mr. Jones, where Randolph Hearst becomes the one that publishes Gareth's expose, but Gareth's already published all these articles. But I think Gareth is the one that potentially makes the introduction for Randolph Hearst to be able to go and meet Hitler himself, which he does, I think, in September 1934. And Randolph Hearst signs a deal with Goebbels to push Nazi propaganda, effectively to push Nazi propaganda in the American press. And yeah, it's all true. And this leads to some of the fake famine stories of early 1935. Anyway, Gareth dines with Randolph Hearst on January the 1st, and then writes 3 articles. Long story, I could talk all about that, but yeah, not the best decision, I think, on Gareth's part to write these articles. But he gets paid fairly well for them, and he's going off on a big trip. So he writes the articles, and then a few days later, he gets a boat across the Pacific, and starts a tour of Southeast Asia. I think he must go to Japan first of all, and then he goes off and travels around Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Malaysia, Singapore, these kind of places. Don't quote me on those. Goes back, spends more time in Japan, and writes interviews. He's constantly interviewing people and writing letters and writing articles. He interviews some very important politicians and military officials in Japan. Asks them what's going on, and then he goes over. Finally, goes to the second time to China. He's already been to Hong Kong and up to Changsha, and he ends up in Peking, and he wants to go up to he already has the idea to go up to the border with Manchukuo. He doesn't really know how to get there. Originally, his original idea was to go on horseback, but I don't think he really thought through the practicalities of that. But he meets at the German embassy, goes to the German embassy, and he meets a guy called Baron von Plessen, who's the high senior German diplomat, who invites him up to a meeting of the princes, which is about to take place in late July 1935. Festival. I think it's based on the Nadam festival, if you know your Mongolian culture. And Gareth jumps at the chance, and he goes. He's another chap there, Dr. Muller, who's a German journalist for Nachrichtenbüro. I can't remember. Anyway, so they all go up. They all go up to on the train up to Inner Mongolia, and Gareth attends this festival of the princes. Really colourful event, it looks like, and he manages to get an interview with a chap called Prince Ter Wang, who was the independence leader, the Mongol independence leader. And I don't know how he manages to get the interview, but he does. And most people go back to Peking, to Beijing, but Gareth and Dr. Muller, the German journalist, get hold of a car from a company called Vostwag, which probably was a sort of Soviet. It was a trading station, but it was a German trading station, but it also had Soviet links. They get in this. They take this car. It's the only car that can travel around in those sort of in that terrain, and they spend several days visiting various monasteries, and then eventually they end up at a place called Dolanor on the Chaha, the Inner Mongolian and the Manchukuo border. And in Dolanor, they stumble across these Japanese troops that aren't really supposed to be there. You know, they're sort of massing, perhaps for an invasion. He writes some very colourful stuff about this town that he's in, about the clouds of opium smoke and the prostitutes everywhere. And then they're wandering around. The next day, they get arrested by the Japanese and questioned and told to get the hell out of there. And according to Gareth's last letter, I think he's told there are two routes back to Kalgan, where they've come from. One of them is infested with bandits, and one of them is safe, he writes. But whichever road they go down, it wasn't the safe road. And they have a terrible journey. The car gets stuck in the mud. People appear in the night. They carry on the next day, and they're passing through a village, and all of a sudden these people dressed in police uniforms jump out from behind the walls and start firing at the car, and it's an ambush, and they are kidnapped. According to Dr. Muller, who's really the only source of information about what happened from this point, the Gareth was taken into one of the huts and given a mock execution, and Gareth says, "No, you can't do this. I'm British," and whether that happened or not, we don't know. And then they're taken off. The driver drives away, and Gareth and the German are taken up into the hills and held captive. And then eventually, after 2 or 3 days, the German is released. That's very suspicious, perhaps, but his story was that they released him because he was so fat that he wouldn't have been able to ride around on the horses. So they just took Gareth because, you know, he was the fit one and was probably the more valuable captive. But sadly, you know, unlike Dr. Muller, who could speak Chinese, Gareth couldn't speak Chinese, and so he was left alone for 2 long, must have been terrible weeks, being ridden around from place to place by these bandits who I believe were probably opium addicts and not, you know, got exchanged from one band of bandits to another band of bandits. And of course, this was all being reported in the news around the world. And headline news, Gareth, Lloyd George's secretary kidnapped, and all this kind of stuff by Chinese bandits. Gareth's poor family were back in Barry, getting snippets of news here, there, and everywhere, including one saying he'd been released. And then that proved not to be true. And after 2 weeks, then they get the phone call, you know, that somebody comes to the door, I think with a telegram. I think that's how it happened. And Gareth's father, Edgar Jones, is this gentleman up here, and opens the telegram and, you know, reads that his son had been shot and they'd fired 3 bullets, one of them into the head. And all that knowledge and all that experience and all those languages and all that charm and humor of this wonderful, really wonderful, amazing human being, I really think he was just ended just like that. And the family was robbed of this ray of sunshine, this brilliant young man. And the world, I think, was robbed of a really great personality who would have gone on to do great things and would have, you know, he had such a knowledge of Germany. He would have advised the British government about how to deal with the Nazis. And quite would he have been against the appeasement policy? I don't know, but he would have been very, you know, very useful. But instead, he was forgotten, and well, I think he wasn't immediately forgotten. I mean, the other chap who'd written about the famine anonymously, Malcolm Muggeridge, denied that Gareth had existed. He knew, you know, they were in perfect. Malcolm Muggeridge took the credit, to his, you know, shame on him. He took the credit and said, "I was the one that exposed the famine." Well, he, you know, he had written about it anonymously, but it was Gareth that really had done this. But he, how was he? He wasn't forgotten in Wales. But I think, you know, there was a certain cloud over his head. His family obviously were devastated, and they didn't want him to take up a career in journalism. They wanted him to be an academic or, you know, live a quiet life. And they warned him, you know, not to, or to try to discourage him, let's say. So on his gravestone, for example, it doesn't mention anything about being a journalist. It just says linguist, traveller, and seeker of peace. Iechyd, teddwyr, carwch, I think, in Welsh. Nothing about being a journalist. And then he is remembered by his friends. People wrote poems about him. There was a memorial fund set up for him. And every year, but then the Second World War happened. And I suppose, yeah, people had other things to think about. Maybe Russia, the Soviet Union was an ally, and they, you know, they didn't want to raise the issue of the famine. And of course, it was something that happened far away. There were no pictures really of it, so that's how he became forgotten. So he was only spoken about around our Sunday dinner table for many decades, and you know, I was brought up by his niece, my mother, and his 2 sisters, Irene Lewis and Gwyneth Vaughan-Jones, would tell stories about him. They both lived to 100 years old. Gareth perhaps would have lived to 100 years old, and I would have been able to meet him. And it's one of the great major regrets of my life, is that, you know, I was robbed of that chance of meeting such an amazing guy. Yeah, he was forgotten about, you know, but my mother knew, you know, she loved him and he doted on her. He he was her only uncle, and she was his only niece, and she sat opposite her father as the ashes came back from China, and my father had the ashes on his lap, and she sat opposite as they took them to their final resting place in Barry. But she carried his memory, and she knew that he was a really special guy, and that something was amiss, that he had been forgotten. And so when she retired, she sort of took it upon herself to look into his story, and get him the recognition he deserved, and that kind of happened beyond her wildest dreams in many ways, because of course he is now, having just been talked about around our dinner table, he's talked about around lots of dinner tables now. So she certainly did succeed with my brother Nigel's assistance in giving him his rightful place in history. But in many ways, it's not the real Gareth Jones that most people know. It's all part of the afterlife, I guess.
Yeah, at one point you wrote that he was kidnapped in life by bandits and kidnapped in death by Banderites. To your knowledge, did you have any awareness of like the Ukrainian nationalist movement, or ever write about that?
Yes, I think he did. He didn't specifically use the initials OUN. He used the initials UWO, which was effectively the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
I believe.
Yeah, the Ukrainian military organization, which
Yeah,
then
that's it.
did spearhead the OUN. So the founder of the OUN was the leader of that organization previously.
Yeah.
But you're saying he wrote about them, or he mentioned
Yeah,
them?
he visited Poland, and he wrote about Polish affairs, and he wrote that the UWO were carrying out terrorist actions in some part of Galicia, I guess. And talked about the pacification campaign, which was launched by Pilsudski, the Polish president. And this was a classic campaign of using terrorism to create, state repression backfire, to get the state to overreact. I think Baader-Meinhof tried and failed to do that in Germany. The OUN, or the UWO, they succeeded in making the Polish government react very violently towards the Ukrainian population. Now, the interesting thing, I think, is that Gareth also wrote about somebody called UNDO, the Ukrainian National Democratic Alliance, who wanted independence. They were the major Ukrainian representatives in Polish Ukraine, or if you want to call it that at the time. And they wanted independence, but they wanted to achieve it through the system, through democratic means, through peaceful means, and through pluralistic means. They weren't anti-Semitic. And when the Nazis invaded, they sided with the Polish government, which makes me often think, that what a shame that the heroes that the Ukraine has decided to pick on as part of their nation building project aren't the Democrats, aren't from UNDO, who were not anti-Semitic, they were democratic, would much more fit into the European model. They instead chose the anti-Semitic fascistic terrorists who, when the Nazis invaded, sided with the Nazis. And they've chosen their leaders, people like Stepan Bandera, Roman Shukevich, as their heroes. Their statues are going up around Ukraine. Whilst the people who perpetrated the Holocaust, while the monuments to the people who did bring the Holocaust to an end, the heroes, Ukrainian and Russian heroes of the Red Army, are being pulled down, which of course is grotesque. Gareth also writes, there was only, even 20 miles from Moscow, there was no bread. So these peasants, they aren't just going, another thing you hear from the Ukrainian nationals, hey, the borders, the borders were all sealed and nobody could get out and everybody was trapped in there being starved to death. I don't think it was quite like that. And the other thing they say is that it's the famine stopped at the borders with Soviet Ukraine and just everyone was fine, but that's clearly not the case. For one thing, Gareth meets peasants on the other side of the border who've extended belly to a Russian, but also the people that are leaving Ukraine to get the bread are going all the way up to Moscow. They're not just going across the border. They're not getting off the train in Belgorod. There's clearly no. Otherwise, why go all the way up to Moscow? Maybe there's an answer I don't know about. And also, if they were sealing the borders, it doesn't necessarily mean that it was to starve everybody to death. It was facing up to there was a situation where there were people, on the other side of the borders, there wasn't much food either, and there were meager food supplies, and it's a kind of perhaps like a fire door situation to stop the famine spreading and keeping it in one place. It doesn't necessarily, there may have been reasons to their cruelty.
Okay, Raphael Lemkin, who coined the term genocide, used the Soviet famine in Ukraine as a classic example.
Raphael Lemkin was talking at a time when no academic works.
Raphael Lemkin coined the word genocide and was very much involved in the Genocide Convention of 1948 and drawing up the definition of genocide. And he did great work, without a doubt, for the Holocaust, for punishing those involved in the Holocaust. But when he came to talk about the famine in the Soviet Union and in Ukraine, I mean, I'm really repeating a lot of what John Paul Himke has said about him, that at the time there was no sort of academic works written about the famine, apart from ones that had been written in 1941 by the Nazis. And so where did he get his information from? According to Jean-Paul Himke says, well, he's getting it from Ukrainian emigres, nationalist emigres, because where else would he be getting his information from? And also John Himke says, well, he was at that stage, he was quite impoverished and, may have been reliant on Ukrainian and Baltic emigres for his livelihood. So he might have been swayed by that. Also that he liberalized his ideas of what constituted genocide and was calling things like the Hungarian uprising and the reaction to it by the Soviets genocide. Lemkin seems to be quite anti-Soviet. He's certainly very quite religious. He's also a Zionist. But what struck me was that he never mentions. Lemkin spends a lot of time in Lvov, as it was then, and his family, I think, must have had family there. But he never mentions the pogrom in Lviv. So he's getting information from from Ukrainian nationalists are telling him about a famine that really they didn't have any direct knowledge of, because they were most of them would have been from Galicia, from Western Ukraine, where the famine happened in Eastern Ukraine. So they're giving him a lot of information about a famine. They don't have much information about themselves, but they're not telling him anything about something they would have known about, which was the Lviv pogrom. And I think there's certain questions to be raised on that. And of course, Gareth was a witness to this. Lemkin was just getting his information from second-hand, third-hand information. So I don't think he's, the ideal. And the other thing, of course, that Himke says is that since the scientific revolution, we've relied on arguments to come to conclusions, not authorities. And just because Lemkin has a great famous name doesn't mean that he's always right. My mother wrote a book called More Than a Grain of Truth, which is Gareth's official biography, which is really interesting, a real insight into those times. Gareth was a great journalist and a great chronicler of the times he was living in, and you see that really in my mother's book. So I would certainly recommend that book. There's a couple of other biographies being written about him, but although they're interesting, and I find they're interesting, they're also written from, I believe, a Ukrainian nationalist point of view. They're just like the film Mr. Jones. The two biographies by Reagan Mash and Martin Shipton, they're batting for the Ukrainian nationalist cause, ultimately, in my opinion. So I wouldn't recommend necessarily those. Go to go to the website garethjones.org, which was set up with a lot of effort by my brother Nigel Colley, which has many of his articles and some of his letters and diary pages. Or the Welsh National Library of Wales has Gareth's archive with many of his letters and diaries and appointment diaries. You need to speak a few languages because he wrote quite a lot in Welsh. I ended up trying to teach myself Welsh to read those, which is an interesting exercise. But he also, his diaries that he kept, he also wrote in French and German and Russian. And when he was in Russia, he would often write important things down in Welsh because he knew the Soviet censors wouldn't be able to read it. So yeah, the archives, and then hang around until I've written my book, which hopefully will happen before too long. The Gareth Jones, the true untold story, because I believe the real story of Gareth Jones hasn't been told. And he'll come out of it with flying, shining colours, but it'll be a more honest appraisal. And there's a lot of stuff out there that hasn't been, that people don't know about, and it's fascinating. The true story of Gareth Jones is far more complex and far more fascinating than the adventure yarn that Miss Chalupa produced for our Ukrainian nationalist friends. This is Gareth's copy of Mein Kampf. I wanted to bring it in last time, but I couldn't find it. So there's his signature at the front.
Oh wow!
And then there, Gareth Jones. Yeah. And I started looking up the names of the people that my mother and brother had been involved in, and one after another, they all turned out to have some association or other with an organisation that was significantly involved in perpetrating the Holocaust, the Organisation of Ukrainian Nationalists.